Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I could address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on March 7th with Sarah Kathryn. She will be giving a presentation entitled Grandma Said What? Gathering and Verifying Your Family's Oral History. We will not be having a webinar next week on February 29th due to Roots Tech. If you would like to access the previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant on observation and common sense, two valuable family history tools that everyone can use. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Kathryn. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history. Somewhat to her surprise, she discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she's a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Her current work assignment includes developing training used on mobile devices. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fresh raspberries. And we'll now turn the time over to Kathryn if she's ready.
Well, welcome everybody. So glad that you could join us for today's webinar. This is a little bit of a departure in that it's from the stuff that I usually do, in that it's a little more, how would I say, conceptual. It talks more about general skills instead of specific things, although we are going to look at some specific examples. Let's look at what we've got on the schedule today. So first of all, why even talk about this topic? We'll explore why this is important, why it matters. And then second, we're going to look at some examples and they're going to be interactive. So get your thinking skills ready and we're going to put some examples on the screen and ask for your observations about these examples. And then finally, we'll wrap up very quickly with some tips. So why are we even having this webinar? Why talk about observation and common sense? Well, before we start, it's a good idea for me to define the terms as we're going to use them in this webinar. So when we say observation, we're really just talking about paying attention, looking at stuff. Have you ever looked at something that was right before your face and you didn't see it? I have. I'm sure we all have had that experience. So we're talking about paying, just the simple act of paying attention. For common sense, we're going to define that as just basic reasoning skills that every human being has. You know, three is more than two, night follows day. They're just things that we know as human beings, and it's what my mom always used to call common sense. So, in family history, here are some examples of common sense. Women don't have children when they're 5. Not rocket science, right? Anybody who's, old enough would know that. Number 2, men don't get married or father children after they die. Again, not rocket science. It's unlikely that a couple would have 25 children. I have seen couples like that in Family Tree or saw one with 40 the other day. Probably that goes against common sense. Every John Pringle who marries a woman named Eleanor is not the same person. This is actually from one of my lines where the Pringle family was from Northumberland. Excuse me. And there were a lot of Johns, as you would imagine, in England. And apparently Eleanor was a very popular name in that area and that time. So there were a number of John Pringles who married Eleanor, but they were different, or married an Eleanor, a woman named Eleanor. But they were clearly different people based on their birth date and their parents and so forth. And yet about 4 of them got merged together on my line. So common sense, though, tells us that Just because a guy is named John Pringle and has a wife named Eleanor, that doesn't mean they're the same person. So here is an example on the screen of a mess. This one is taken in from Family Tree. Family Search's Family Tree. But honestly, I've seen messes on other public trees. It's definitely a challenge in family history. But let's take a look at this and see what kind of goes against common sense. So we've got this Thomas McLean here. His PID ends in VPW, VPW, VPW. So this is the same guy, but he's got three different wives. Well, that's not that unusual to have three different spouses because your first spouse might die and so forth. But as we take a closer look, as we observe, this guy was married within 6 years to three different women. That's kind of not making sense. All three wives are named Elizabeth. That's really a stretch. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely. But the thing that is really the clincher here that goes against common sense is okay, he marries this gal, Thomas marries this gal in 1789, and they have 11 children. So he's with her for at least, 15 to 20 years. And yet down here, he's getting married to somebody else 7 years later in a totally different location. That it's just probably not going to happen. The thing is, we look at this, right? And it's very easy to see the violations of common sense. But why didn't, oh, and I should say, when I got into the change log, this guy had like, I don't know, six merges on him or something that were not, that they're not all the same people. So some different Thomas McLeans got mangled, excuse me, got mangled together. And so the question that naturally arises then is that we look at this and we could see that it doesn't make sense. Why didn't the person doing the merges notice that? Well, in order to answer that question, I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer, but after working with many people over the years on their family history, I think we can point to some reasons that this happens. So I want to frame this by sharing with you a couple of experiences that I had helping people. So the first one, I was helping a friend of mine, and she was just getting started on family history. She was a very bright woman. She was a medical technician. So not only was she very intelligent, but she also was technically savvy. So she knew her stuff. She was in a highly trustworthy position in her work. So we're looking at her lines, and Family Search gives a possible duplicate hint. So we go into it, and she's, of course, at the computer. I'm just kind of a guide at the side. And when she brings up possible duplicates, for those of you who may not have used it, in Family Tree, they will compare the the two people. Excuse me. Sorry, coughing here. They will compare the two people, the two potential duplicates side by side so that you can see all the information and decide if they're the same person or not. Well, as I quickly looked down the screen at all the facts for the two people, it was actually pretty obvious that they weren't the same person. So the dates were questionable, the places didn't make sense, the relationships, as I recall, the parents were different. And so, of course, the siblings were different. So in just a few seconds, I had looked at it and said, okay, based on what I'm seeing here, these two people cannot be the same and should not be merged. But as a helper trying to help my friend develop the skills, of course, I'm not going to blurt that out and say, "Oh, they're not the same. Get out of here." But I wanted her to have the experience of doing the observation. So I said, "Yeah, here, see what we're looking at." And I think it was probably the first time she'd ever done a merge. So I said, "What we're looking at is on the left hand, you see one of the people, on the right hand, you see the other person, and we're supposed to compare them, and we're supposed to decide whether they're really the same person." So she looked at the screen for probably less than a second and said, "Yep, I think they're the same." And so I kind of backed up and said, well, let's look at this a little more carefully. And I pointed out the discrepancies and so forth. And we didn't do the merge. But here is my point. Here's what I think we can learn from this experience. My friend was highly skilled and highly technical. So the problem was not a lack of intelligence. The problem was a lack of observation. And there's a couple reasons that happens, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's look at another experience. So I was working in with a group project, and one of the individuals in the project was entering names incorrectly into Family Tree. Another member of the group commented on this. In fact, I think a couple of people did. And I don't think they were rude. I think they commented on it to this person and just said, hey, it's when you enter names in Family Tree, you should do it this way, not this other way, because this other way can cause problems. Well, interestingly enough, despite the people trying to give some positive feedback in a good way, the person responded, well, I'm not a genealogist, and so I guess I just do things my own way. So here's the interesting thing about that is that this person, whom I know personally, was very sincere in wanting to do family history, just had a testimony of it, had a strong desire to make a contribution. But he had come to the false conclusion that since he wasn't like a credentialed or a trained genealogist, that he should just kind of do whatever he personally felt was right. And so, and if we think about that, that really goes against common sense. It's a little like a farmer, well, no, like a gardener, somebody who's, say, an amateur gardener who decides they're going to plant something, plant a little garden. And so they decide that since they're not a professional farmer, the law of the harvest does not apply to them. That just doesn't make sense. And the law of the harvest applies to everybody, whether you're a novice gardener or a farmer. And it's the same in family history. There are certain concepts and best practices that apply to everybody, whether they're new or whether they're highly experienced. So, why do people sometimes, as we saw in these two examples, why do people sometimes minimize or even skip observation and common sense when doing family history? Well, I think we could deduce a few reasons from those examples, which are actually not unique, to be honest with you. I've seen those in multiple different, um, had multiple similar experiences. So one is what I believe is a false dilemma, and that is if I'm not a professional, then genealogy is a black box to me, and I have no hope of understanding what professional genealogists do. So I may as well just muddle through and do whatever seems like the right thing to me because I'll never be able to understand it. So there we got a false dilemma. Another one is trusting technology too much. And I think that's what happened in the first experience. My friend in the medical profession had to rely on very trustworthy technology because lives are at stake, right? And so I think she came to family history with the same expectation that the technology would be very exact. The trouble is, family history, as probably all of us are aware, is more of an art than a science. I mean, there are facts and things that we want to rely on, but there's a lot of nuance in family history, and the software reflects that. And you notice in Family Tree, it doesn't say, when you get a duplicate notice, it doesn't say this is definitely a duplicate. It says possible duplicate. And then we're supposed to make the determination on that. We're supposed to use our skills of observation and common sense to determine whether those two people are the same. And the last one is just assuming accuracy. I've noticed that there's a tendency, for one thing, to believe in the old days, it was to believe anything in print. Oh, I read it in the newspaper or I read it in a book, so it must be true. Well, not necessarily. And then today it's, well, I read it on the internet or I read it online, so it must be true. Or I saw it in family search, or I saw it in an ancestry tree or a MyHeritage tree or whatever. So since it's published someplace, it must be true, and I don't need to worry about sanity checking it. So I think all of these things contribute to especially new users skipping over observation and common sense when doing their family history. Now, at this point, I want to be really clear that the purpose of this webinar is not to bemoan the lack of common sense, because let's be honest, we've all had our moments of a lack of common sense or lack of observation, not seeing something that's right in front of our face. So my purpose isn't to be critical or to complain, but it's actually to give hope. Because if these are two skills, if observation and common sense are two skills that everybody has and that everybody can use, well, then you don't have to be a professional genealogist, right? Or you don't need credentials. You've got hope that you've already got the skills you need. You just need to apply them. We all just need to apply them. It's a little as though you were with some friends and you said, "Hey, can I borrow $5? I don't have any money." And one of your friends said, "Hey, why don't you double check in your pockets, or for women, check your purse or your wallet or whatever." And you look in and, oh, wait, there's $5. I already have $5. I don't need to borrow it. I think it's the same with these skills. We all have them inherently as human beings. Maybe we just need to focus a little more and pay more attention to applying those skills in family history. So let's dive into our fun examples. And I am going to bring up the chat because unfortunately we don't have audio for these webinars, but would you please answer in the chat? So as you look at these two dates, this is for my ancestor Francis Bescaby, and we've got a birth date here, and we've got a christening date here. Do these two dates make sense? If yes, why? And if no, why not? Yes, Debbie, you're exactly right. The christening would be after the birth. So Debbie nailed it. Yeah, and Joy also nailed it from the chat. And Gordon also points out that the location is a problem, which is true. But here we've got, I mean, there's no way this person that was born in 37 wasn't even conceived in 34. So it's not even like somebody could bless the mother's womb or something. This person just wasn't on earth and couldn't have been christened. Um, 3 years earlier than they were born. So good eyes, you guys, good common sense and good observation. Let's look at the next one. Did I say we've got 5 examples? And they're all pretty simple, so this won't take too long. Do these dates make sense? We've got Thomas being born this year, Drusilla this year, the marriage this year, and the first kid being born this year. So are these dates right? And if something's wrong, what is it and why? Yeah, Debbie, good job again. Marriage not possible. So, have you heard of somebody born in 48 still being alive in 1973? Not so much, right? Now, my guess is here, honestly, if this 73 makes sense with 74, I think this is just a simple typo. I think the person meant to type 1873 and accidentally typed 1973. But notice that apparently after they typed the date, there was no observation, no double checking to make sure that it made sense. And so again, we see how common sense and observation can help us avoid these types of problems. And it's simple, right? It's not rocket science. It's just like, look at the dates. Oh, whoops, I made a typo. Got to fix that. Okay, here's a favorite one, and this is like a representative sample, but I'll tell you how this came about. This is based on a real experience I had. So I do have an ancestor named Ann Dell, who was born in the 1800s, and one day I signed on to find that she had 5 children that I didn't know about. So here is Andel, Representative Andel, born in 1811. Here's another Andel with no birth information, but she does have a kid. Can these two Andels be the same people? And if yes or no, why or why not? Yep, exactly. We've got Debbie and Gordon have both noticed that the birth of the child does not make sense given the birth of the mother. So again, this isn't rocket science. This is just observation and common sense because we all know that women don't have children many years before their own birth. And yet, in on my line, as I mentioned, somebody had added 5 children born before my Andel to my Andel, and they couldn't possibly be hers. This gives me a chance to point out something that is probably the biggest cause of problems in a shared tree, whether you're in Family Search or WikiTree or wherever you're working in a shared tree. It is what I call the same name trap, which is assuming that two different people are the same person just because they have the same name. And if we stop to observe and use common sense, then usually we can tell with great confidence whether they're the same or not. But if we don't use those two skills, it's so easy to just jump to the conclusion, oh, well, their names are both Andel, so I guess they're the same. But that is not always the case. And this next example will help us solidify this concept. So, are these two Charles Coneys, the ones outlined in red, are they the same person? Yep, Debbie, you nailed it. We actually cannot tell. Because the truth is, there could be two guys named Charles Coney born in the same place in the same year. I mean, think about, yeah, granted, South Somercotes is small, but they could be cousins. I've seen that on my line before. Like I had two Emma Bescabys born, and that's a pretty unusual name, Bescaby. They were born within 6 months of each other, but they were cousins. They belonged in different families. So we cannot tell from this screen. It might be tempting. Let me just get rid of that little yellow box. Um, it, oh dear, sorry. It could be tempting to jump to the conclusion that they're the same because there is a lot of information in common. The year is the same, the name is the same, of course, and the location is the same. But these are search results from Find My Past. So the next screen is going to show us the record for each of those guys. Now, tell me if these guys are the same and why or why not. Yep, Gordon, you nailed it. Different parents. Debbie pointed out that we've got two different dates here. Charles was christened or baptized on the 30th of April, whereas the other Charles is 11th of June. So just looking at that screen before, we could have jumped to the conclusion that they were the same, but in fact, they were not. And this is such a valuable skill to take the time to observe and use common sense when you're dealing with people with similar information in Family Tree. This last one is based on an error. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had this little message. So we avoided the same name trap through observation and common sense. This last one is based on a mistake that I made. So I didn't discover it for like a couple of years, which really reinforced to me the importance of observation and common sense. I know this is a little hard to read, but I'll talk through it and then we've got a transcript. So we've got Charles Hollingworth. He's the head. He's 36. He's married to Mary Ann, and they've got 3 children with them in the census. One is 7, one is 5, and one is 2. Let me switch over to the transcript and ask this question. Is Mary Ann the mother of these 3 children? Right, Gordon, you nailed it. That's exactly right. This couple has been married only 1 year. And when I first did this family, I had been researching Charles oh, no, wait, I'd been researching Marianne. But well, this gets a little complicated. So I was researching Marianne and I thought this was my Marianne. So I just looked at this and I said, oh, good, my Marianne married Charles. And I actually had found a marriage record. Good, she married Charles. These must be their kids. And I put them all in family tree as a family, not paying any attention to this. It turned out, so see, she hasn't even had any kids yet that were born alive. And as I recall, I can't remember if she might have had one that had died, their first child or something. I'd have to go back and look at the census. But what was the interesting thing here is this Charles, before he married this Marianne, he married my Marianne, and they were both named Marianne. Talk about confusion. So the first Marianne he married, I believe, oh shoot, I should have looked this up because it's been a while, but I think the first one was Marianne Guy. Yeah, it was Guy on my Guy line, Guy. So his first wife was Marianne Guy. His second wife was Marianne Sugars. What an awesome name, right? But these three children were the children of my Marianne Guy, not of Marianne Sugars. So again, like I said, I discovered this a couple of years later when I revisited the family, and I had to go back in and fix the mistake that I had made. And again, not rocket science, right? If I had just looked at the census a little more carefully, it would have been obvious that these kids were not from the present marriage. Okay, so those are some examples of just using our skills of common sense and observation to either avoid or to solve problems in family tree or in our family history. Let's wrap up with 3 tips. So the first one is, and I have found this to be so important in avoiding problems and using our skills, it is simply to slow down. Sometimes, for whatever reason, there's probably multiple reasons. When we're doing family history, we feel like we've got to rush. Maybe we only have a half an hour before the kids get home or before dinner's due or whatever. And so we try and rush as fast as possible to fit in things, or there may be other reasons that we're rushing. I have known of some people who, for them, the numbers are the thing. So the more names they add, the better. That's a position that I actually disagree with, just because it's not a sign of worth or value or contribution to have a high number of names. Because what if you rush so fast that you add a lot of names that aren't valid, or you create your tree and it's based on mixing up the two Mariannes or whatever. So, slowing down is such good advice in family history and honestly in lots of areas of life. It's hard to observe and use common sense if we're rushing too much. And it's easy to make mistakes. At least for me, it has been. I find that I make a lot more mistakes when I rush. And here's the crazy thing, cleaning up those mistakes takes longer than the time that I saved by rushing. And this is very, very true in family history. Next one is trust your instincts. I have worked with people on occasion who, because they were new to family history and because they didn't trust, like they had what they considered low technology skills, even if they looked at something in Family Tree that they thought was wrong, they thought, well, I'm a novice. I can't trust myself, so I'm just going to trust what's in here in Family Tree, even though I kind of don't really think it's right. Well, that can be a mistake to not trust our instincts. So, my advice to all of us would be to trust your gut feeling or your instinct or your inspiration, whatever you want to call it. If something seems off, then look for more information and also don't assume that family history technology is foolproof. In fact, most technology is not foolproof. Some of it, like the medical technology, is often much better, much stricter. They have to meet stricter standards, so their technology can be more trustworthy. But for run-of-the-mill technology, such as the software we use every day, we can't assume that it's foolproof. We want to trust our instincts and verify things if we think something's wrong. And the last one is kind of related to that, and that is to verify our assumptions. On that Charles Coney example, it would have been really easy to assume that those two guys were the same just looking at the names and the year and the place. But it's so helpful to ask ourselves, if you're making an assumption, do I have proof for this assumption? And if I really don't have proof, take some time to look for it. And especially watch out for the assumption of the same name trap. That's again the thing that can get us into so much trouble in family tree, is just assuming that two people are the same when they really aren't. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining. By way of a quick summary, we talked about how observation and common sense are really very important skills in family history, and all of us have these skills. We just need to apply them. We went over 5 examples, and you guys gave very good feedback on them. And then finally, we ended up with these tips: slow down, trust your instincts, and verify your assumptions. So everybody, thank you so much for coming today to our webinar. And let me see, I'm just looking at the chat here. Let me see if there's anything in the Q&A. Nope, nothing in the Q&A, but I see a very good reminder up here from, let's see, it's just scrolling off the screen, just a second. A very good reminder from Roy, who says, always look at the image of a record. Some things have indexing mistakes. Yes, excellent point. We can't assume that an index is correct. Most of the time, it's pretty darn good, but sometimes some critical information is wrong on the index that you can verify, find out the right information by looking at the image. Uh, Let me see. Roy, thank you so much for that great observation. Yeah, Roy also made the observation that there are lots of problems with census records. That is so true. And thank you for the kind words, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on March 7th with Sarah Cochran on Grandma Said What? Gathering and Verifying Your Family's Oral History. Note that we won't be having a webinar next week on February 29th due to Ruth's sick. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.